Good afternoon. Welcome to the Dumiso Dabengwa Foundation memorial lecture. My name is Brighton Ndlovu, the communications officer for the Dumiso Dabengwa Foundation. Today we're going to have a lecture, a memorial lecture for Dumiso Dabengwa. It's called Revisiting Zimbabwe: Trajectory, the Idea of the Liberation. It's going to be delivered by Professor Sabelo, Gatsheni, Ndlovu. Right. I'm going to introduce the professor is going to deliver the lecture. We are honored as the foundation to have the esteemed Sabelo Gatsheni Ndlovu to present the DD Memorial Lecture titled Revisiting the Idea of Zimbabwe and the Trajectory of Liberation. He is currently the professor and chair of epistemologies of the Global South, with emphasis on the Africa at the University of Rhine-Ruhr in Germany, but he holds many positions at institutions such as UNISA. His field of work comprises of research into history of African resistance to colonialism, history of Ndebele-speaking people in Zimbabwe, history of Zimbabwe nationalism and liberation struggle, decolonial and post-colonial theory, amongst other fields. Our founder, Dumiso Dabengwa, valued him so much and his work. He understood the importance of Dr. Gatsheni's research. We are pleased today to have him to present the first lecture for us, and I think it's going to be the first of many, we hope, in future. So, Professor Sabelo Gatsheni Ndlovu, welcome to the Dumiso Dabengwa annual lecture.
Thank you so much, Brighton. You can hear me, yeah?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead with the presentation.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Dumiso Dabengwa Foundation for inviting me to deliver this memorial lecture. It is indeed an honor and indeed also a challenge, a big challenge to be invited to deliver this 2021 Dumiso Dabengwa lecture, and it will be clear as I proceed. But what I want to do today is to look at, perhaps to reflect on at least four main issues. Firstly, I want to make opening remarks on the challenges of remembering a veteran nationalist and a liberation struggle icon like Dumiso Dabengwa, through situating him in history, memory, and the present. And this situating of Dabengwa in the memory, history, and the present, of course, entangles him in contestations. And you must all remember that one of Dabengwa's consistent calls was for the research and the writing of a correct history of the liberation struggle. And he left us with that challenge to do that. And I won't attempt it now, but it's a challenge which I know it exists and it needs to be done. Then secondly, I will reflect on Dabengwa as a nationalist and indeed a maker of Zimbabwean nationalism and a contributor to the very invention of the idea of Zimbabwe, of which he dedicated his entire life to its actualization. And then I will end by using the memory of Dr. Dumiso Dabengwa to reflect on the very idea of Zimbabwe, its trajectory from its conceptions in the 1960s right up to the present. If I can begin, I think the first challenge every time we try to remember figures of history is that history itself and the memory are contested sides of struggles. And the nationalist history and the memory is even worse. In our country, in Zimbabwe, you will realize that we've shifted from what Masipulas Tole termed struggles within the struggle to struggles after the struggle. It is even more complicated to remember a political figure like a Dr. Dumiso Dabengwa, who belonged to ZAPU, whose archives were confiscated, and whose history has been subjected to silencing, distortion, and the attempts to write it out of the national narrative. So you will see that intertwined with the memory of Dumiso Dabengwa, his party, the forces he commanded, there is indeed a central problem of theft of history, and indeed an epistemicide, which is the killing of particular histories and memories in order to project some. And we must know that this theft of history is not an innocent theft, is not an ordinary theft, if I can put it that way. The theft of history is always an essential prerequisite for the theft of lives of the people whose history has been stolen. And that theft of life itself, we call it genocide. But I want to, in these opening remarks, to reflect on a challenge which Dr. Dumiso Dabengwa left us with, and that is his consistent call to write a truthful history of the liberation struggle in particular, and of Zimbabwe in general. And he started this call as long back as the 1990s, when he attended a conference at the University of Zimbabwe, which was on the liberation struggle, where he said, the definitive history of Zimbabwe's liberation struggle is yet to be written. So far, most attempts has been either lacking in objectivity, even openly biased in some cases, or have been merely brief sketches of events. And he continued to say, this is unfortunate because the liberation war has had and they will continue to have profound consequences for the future of Zimbabwe and the other countries in the Southern African region. And it was also Dr. Dabengwa who critiqued our official history of the country by saying our official history is a mythical narrative about leaders. It is mythical history which does not record the deeds of simple liberation fighters. The official history does not recognize the gallant fights and the contributions of Zipra. And he went on to say, our official history of the country cannot face inconvenience truth. And the Dabengwa therefore urged us to continue to tell the truth. And he challenged us, particularly those who are historians and social scientists, by saying we must confront truth head on and openly. We must rid ourselves of biases. We must rise above fear of being isolated and even victimized for telling the truth. We must avoid timidity, sectarianism, and outright opportunism. And he made a clear call for a new breed of social scientists capable of withstanding threats and intimidation. His wish was for social scientists who will fight against suppression of any information and pursue selfless inquiries. But against all this, you will find that we are at the moment at the center of what I will call struggles after the struggle. And these have taken the form of authorized and commissioned biographies, and indeed hagiographies, as well as autobiographies purporting to put the self at the center of the liberation struggle, and in the process trying to outshine each other. And Dabengwa, I don't think that's what he wanted us to do. One can wonder why there are these struggles after the struggle, but I think the explanation is very clear. The reason is that the liberation struggle and what has come to be rendered as war credentials continue to be abused and used to access public office, legitimacy, and the ownership of the resources. The liberation war credentials could be manufactured, and this is the worst case. It could be manufactured. You can be given liberation war credentials, and also they can be withdrawn. And we know the case of Joyce Mjuru, whereby this then complicates the whole issue of history and the memory of these leading figures in the nationalist struggle in a very big way, because history and the memory become open to post-truth politics and even fake news habits. And the second challenge which I see as we try to remember Dr. Dabengwa is that our nationalism itself has reached its most problematic phase. It has always been contested and permeated by ethnicity and power struggles in the first instance, and in the second instance, it has been abused to the extent that those born after 1980 have no good story to tell about what was delivered by the anti-colonial nationalist struggle. Some have memory of hunger, memory of poverty, memory of unemployment, yet others have memory of being forced by difficult circumstances at home, which threw us into hostile diasporic environment. Yet others have memory of state brutality, violence, and yet even more, some has memory of a genocide and marginalization. Then the third challenge, which I also think is important for us to address as we remember Dr. Dumiso Dabengwa, is that there is no way we can remember a nationalist icon like Dumiso Dabengwa without thinking about the current state of our nation and our country, where the very idea of Zimbabwe is subjected to contestations, with some calling it their thing, and on the one end with others, because of suffering, because of feelings of marginality and exclusion, even rejecting it totally and calling for secession. As a people who are besieged by many troubles, making the very meaning of being independent and being free sound empty and hollow. As a people who are not yet united into a nation state, this raises the question of what type of polity was born in 1980 and what have we done with our belonging, citizenship, and the pan-ethnic patriotism. Just like under colonialism, as a people, we have witnessed the opulence on the side of the elites and the poverty on the side of the majority. And this raises the question of the material question of redistribution of national resources, who benefited and who did not. We also live in a country where the members of the security sector, be they soldiers, police, CIO, instead of providing social peace, national peace, and tranquility, they exist as fiat formations and the merchants of terror. And this raises a governance question of how we have governed ourselves since 1980. There are also cases of harassment of women and women abuses, which raises a fundamental question of heteropatriarchy and misogyny. And the painful fact that Dumiso Dabengwa himself had to die seeking medical help outside Zimbabwe raises important issues of infrastructure development of the country since 1980, particularly the area of service delivery and the domains of health and education. These questions trouble us and they require answers, and they actually lead us to even venture into some of the most topical issues, whereby how do we resolve crimes in which the state and its security agents are the criminals who terrorize and killed the people? And to me, these are questions, are hard and difficult questions, which actually require hard and difficult conversations, particularly if we are one people, if we are patriotic people. The fourth challenge, which I see, is that a figure like Dumiso Dabengwa was many things at once. He was a veteran of the nationalist struggle, a freedom fighter, a guerrilla, a well-known intelligence leader within a liberation movement, a nation builder, a prisoner before and after independence, a minister and an opposition leader, right up to his death. Already, we can see that in our country, these diverse political identities have been reduced to two. Either you are a nationalist leader or you are a war veteran. And the others who participated in other capacities are not recognized. But I want to use the history and the legacy of Dabengwa to reflect on the trajectory of the liberation struggle itself. And I want not to talk about him as a Black Russian, which is very popular, his involvement in the intelligence as a Zipra Supremo, but I want to go a bit back to reflect on Dabengwa as a nationalist. And I must refer you to here to a slim book entitled The Organizer, the story of Themba Moyo, which was published in 1974, which provide details on the development of Dabengwa's political consciousness within a colonial context and his aversion for colonialism, and how he used his education to understand discrimination and Black oppression. And I want also to rethink the position of Dabengwa. Dabengwa was just not merely a soldier within the liberation struggle or an intelligence officer. Dabengwa is actually a nationalist, a leading nationalist in the first instance, who joined the National Democratic Party in 1960, I'm sorry. And I'm interested in this because those people who were there in the 1960s are part and parcel of the figures who contributed to the very making of Zimbabwean nationalism, the articulation of the very idea of Zimbabwe. Dabengwa, therefore, I must say, was not born in Zimbabwe. Dabengwa, if we want to speak about him correctly, Zimbabwe was born in him. He was not born in Zimbabwe. There was no Zimbabwe by then. If we agree with that, therefore, in a sense, he becomes part and parcel of a pantheon of the fathers of the nation. But the problem arises, how many fathers of the nation do we have? And I always think that we need to pluralize the issue of a father. We must have fathers of the nation so that it is not monopolized by one or person, because there were many people who participated in the conception of the idea of Zimbabwe. Dabengwa was active in the youth front of the NDP, which in his own words became the nucleus of the new party in Bulawayo. The characterization of Dabengwa as the organizer emerged in his skills and the active role in the recruitment of youth to the NDP. If we miss this history, we won't appreciate the fact that Dabengwa was actively involved in the very making of Zimbabwean nationalism and his contribution to the unfolding of the idea of Zimbabwe. Dabengwa is also one of those early nationalists to be charged for inflammatory statements under the notorious Law and Order Maintenance Act, and he lost his job because of his NDP political activities. And he was declared to be a security risk as early as the 1960s. When the NDP was banned in 1961, Dabengwa was a political prisoner. And when ZAPU was formed, after that, Dabengwa was still in prison and he was left with 4 months to complete his sentence. Dabengwa considered the imprisonment as baptism of fire, which made him even more committed to the anti-colonial struggle. And he emerged from prison to be a regional officer in ZAPU. And when ZAPU was banned in 1962, Dabengwa went underground to continue the political work, but it did not take time before he was arrested and given a restriction order. But what is interesting is that he was restricted to family farm until further notice. But even during that time, they had to inform the local native commissioner, who was told that Dabengwa was, and I quote, one of the new breeds of dangerous nationalists. After release from restriction, Dabengwa continued his political work and played his role in organizing the called Comfort Conference, which led to the formation of the People's Caretaker Council, which was actually an interim body to represent and mobilize the people. And I thought it would be important to highlight this early history because it is always forgotten that Dabengwa is really part and parcel of a pantheon of fathers of this nation, Zimbabwe. And if you read clearly that book, The Organizer, the story of Themba Moyo, you will find that it has finer details on Dabengwa's involvement in the foundation of the armed struggle, right up to the crisis which hit ZAPU in the period 1969 to 1971. But what you can realize is that after the Cold Comfort Conference, Dabengwa was one of those who were instructed to go to Zambia from Bulawayo, and they were mobilized from the Bulawayo Youth Front to proceed for military training. In June 1964, Dabengwa's group was sent to Soviet Union, where they were trained. On deployment to the front in 1965, Dabengwa writes, "My major responsibilities were reconnaissance and establishing a network of reliable contacts so as to escalate our operations." He was back in Zambia by 1960 to report back to the external headquarters. With a 15-man unit, Dabengwa returned to the front and organized the reconnaissance and operations in Lupane and Urungu. These were the first ZAPU forces to engage the enemy in open combat. And in that book also, Dabengwa reflects on the 1967-1968 armed clashes between a combined ZIPRA and the MK forces in Wanki, Spolilo, and the other places, which was a three-pronged offensive. And he writes that throughout this campaign, I was assigned to reconnaissance and the operations. My mission took me far into the country, even into the cities. My objectives were to keep track of the enemy personnel and the equipment movements and seek suitable targets for sabotage. Several times I was personally involved in combats I helped to plan. 1968, he was part of 7-man unit sent to carry out reconnaissance in the Mutoko region east of Salisbury. And Dabengwa provides minute details of that mission to and back. 1969, he was back again on a reconnaissance mission and explained how the contact person they were trying to use was trying to sell them out. And then the book actually ends with a few reflections on the crisis which hit ZAPU in 1969 to 1971, and how then after the crisis there was the formation of ZIPRA. And I wanted to raise this because the stories of these luminaries, the memories of these luminaries, nationalist luminaries, sometimes is always taken, particularly for Dabengwa, is always thought of in terms of his intelligence work, which happened later, but we always forget his nationalist background, which is very important. Then I want to go to the last part of my presentation, which is how do we use the memory of Dumiso Dabengwa to reflect on the idea of Zimbabwe? And I want to start by making a few remarks, which will make me unpopular, but sometimes it's important to say the truth. The first issue which I want to say is that let's not make a mistake that to take over Rhodesian state means that we have created Zimbabwe. It doesn't mean that. Zimbabwe had never been a pre-existing formation. As a unitary state, Zimbabwe had to be created afresh. Zimbabwe has never been a successor state. And we need to get these clearly, because if we get this clearly, we will know the enormity of creating Zimbabwe. Of course, when I say this, I'm not being oblivious of our pre-colonial history. I'm actually well aware of our pre-colonial history. I'm actually aware that we come from diverse ethnic and social backgrounds. And I'm aware that we have a rich pre-colonial history with the states, with kingdoms, with chiefdoms. You can name them as the Torah, the Rose, the Barwe, Manika, Ndebele, Gaza, Mtapa, and the many others, which fell and rose in the space between the Zambezi and the Limpopo rivers. And how did the nationalists then use and deploy that rich history to create nationalism? I think that is the main questions. And that's the main issue which we need to understand. Because nationalism had to be created from symbols. It has to be created from some cultural artifacts. Early nationalists even utilize the cultural side of Great Zimbabwe to name the imaginary post-colonial Zimbabwe. And during that time, they even toyed with using matopos. So there was that debate whether should we call it Zimbabwe or should we call it matopos, because of the spiritual and the ritual significance of that. But the most well-known myth or foundation of the modern Zimbabwe actually goes as far back as the resistance to colonialism. And generally, they tend to ignore the Anglo-Ndebele War of 1893, and they emphasize more the 1896 uprising as the foundation myth. And indeed, there is a lot which was drawn from that a form of resistance in terms of the heroes and the heroines to inspire those who were fighting for independence. But again, we needed to be careful that we don't use our heroes selectively in such a way that we become careless in our selection of heroes and ignore others, particularly if we are about the building of the nation. And we must also underscore that colonialism obviously was our enemy number one, and the colonialism never wanted us to be a nation of a collective people. Colonialism wanted to always keep us as inchoate and contending tribes, as they said. And it was the duty of nationalists like Dabengwa and the others to actually mobilize us out of our invented ethnic categories into a national collective. And they used what we call pedagogical nationalism to do that, to mobilize. But I think it is important that even now we go back to those strategies of mobilizing the people for a national cause, because the people, we must not assume them to be existing as an organized formation in the first instance. We need to consistently mobilize each other for whatever we're fighting for. And I want to move on to the present, and then I will conclude. And the one thing which I want to say is that after the 1896-1897 uprising, the next important event, of course, becomes our armed national liberation struggle, which I see as a school for heightening consciousness and the definition of the enemy, and indeed also consistent articulation of the idea of Zimbabwe. And it remains one of our proudest moments as a people, where our love for the nation evoked the sacrifices of lives. And I must say that nationalism, the nationalists, the Dabengwa's generation, I think they were successful in using nationalism to lay a foundation for armed struggle. And the armed struggle had to be used to make sure that we realize concretely a post-colonial sovereign nation called Zimbabwe. But there were always hovering global imperial designs consisting of the British, who were not only responsible for the colony of Rhodesia, but were interested in ensuring that the future of white minority settlers was well catered for at the end of colonialism. And this takes us to Lancaster, where Dabengwa was involved again at the Lancaster House Conference. Zimbabwe was born out as a negotiated idea with a very restrictive constitution and a protection of material privileges of the white settlers and unresolved land question. And I must say, also an unresolved ethnic question and a no clear nation building blueprint. Unlike South Africa, where there was always the Freedom Charter to which people would refer to. For us in Zimbabwe, we did not produce such a blueprint. Of course, we have the Kombela Declaration, Mkagawa Declaration, and all these had nothing to do with nation building. They were more to do with who is supposed, the power questions and the not national question. Even though the Freedom Charter in South Africa is itself been exposed to heavy criticism for saying South Africa belongs to all who live in it, but at least they had something. And I think in Zimbabwe, we need something like that, even at the current moment, whereby how do we want to live together? What are the ethics of us living together? And I think it is important. And you can see our desperation when people run to Prime Minister Mugabe's reconciliation speech of 1981, and trying to say that is the foundation of the nation. But it was never written anyway. It was never made into a policy anyway. It was largely targeted also at the minority white people. And there was an assumption that black people were already united when we knew in our hearts of hearts that we were not a united people. So we need to open up to that difficult question, that do we want really to live together as a united people? And if we want to live together as a united people, what are the ethics of living together? Of course, the Constitution is one expression of that, but we will need to think deeply about it. And the coalition government of the short-lived coalition government of 1980 to 1982 was another attempt, but it collapsed within 1.5 years. And the other opportunity which was missed, I think, was the making of the Zimbabwe National Army. I think that was also, instead of just saying it was an integration of the Rhodesian Army, the ZIPRA and the ZANLA, it was also a lever of nation building. And you will see, if you read the book by Judith Toth, Dabengwa and Lookout Masuku writing a letter to the Prime Minister, who was also the Minister of Defense, again raising their fears that the way the politics is interfering with the military, there is a danger of subversion, first of all, of the military issues, and secondly, of the whole spirit of reconciliation, and the preferential treatment, which actually meant that the army, the national army, then emerges as a process of Zanlafication rather than really a unitary army of all those. And this takes us to our greatest failure as a nation. And the greatest failure as a nation comes only 3 years after independence. That is in 1983, the beginning of the Gukurahundi operation, right up to 1987. And the Dabengwa again features there as a victim of Gukurahundi, because it was accompanied by arrests, detention, torture, rape, and the burning of homes, and the disappearances, and making of concentration camps like Balako, and the mass killings. And from there, you will understand why I emphasize this issue of Gukurahundi. To me, it was the first moment signifying lack of commitment to nation building and the over-investment in consolidation of partisan political power at the expense of the nation. It was during that period that there was emphasis on the idea of Ruzhinji, the majority. The tyranny of the majority could not be avoided. And the mistaken idea that a nation is made out of a majority ethnic groups and the others need just to grovel behind. What had emerged in 1960s as a popular African nationalism could not be translated in my understanding into post-colonial horizontal pan-ethnic patriotic comradeship. And the question of being patriotic emerged during that time in its most problematic rendition and the articulation, whereby you needed to belong to the ruling party, you needed to have a ZANU-PF card, you needed to belong, not to belong to the opposition. And at times it was even reduced linguistically, you needed to speak a particular language. And that emerges from the way the people of Matabele and the Miklands regions were treated and forced to sing and speak a particular language and to take these political cards from political parties. Being a supporter of ZAPU carried a death sentence during that time. Speaking Ndebele carried a death sentence. Having fought for the liberation of Zimbabwe under ZAPU and the ZIPRA carried a death sentence. Being a ZAPU leader carried a death sentence. Even Joshua Nkomo had to run for his life in 1983. Therefore, I think we cannot therefore minimize Operation Gukurahundi, and I will explain why it is important, not only for Matabeleland, but for the whole of Zimbabwe. That it cannot be reduced to a mere moment of madness. It was more than that. Our problematic nationalism with its haunting ethnic subtext hit its lowest ebb during that time. But I don't want also to bore you with a lot of history whereby our attempts to unite, the Unity Accord of 1987, the Global Political Agreement of 2008, Operation Restore, Ligas of November 2017 and the current Pollard, all these which are nothing to do with the nation building, but with the accommodation of political elites and the consolidation of power. So I'm thinking here of a bigger issue, which is the nation building, which is not about consolidation of power and the state power. Nation building, which speaks about the making of people into one people, the people from diverse ethnicities, diverse racial groups, diverse genders into one people. I think to me that is one of the most important aspects. And I think Dabengwa also was not mute about that. In 2011, he gave a speech at Sapes Trust in Harare where he expressed his ideas on the national question and how it could be resolved. And his idea was that, in my view, the national question that has bothered each one of us is how to transform Zimbabwe from pseudo-democracy to real democracy. And Dabengwa expressed his misgiving about the propensity to always think that our solution lies in changing leaders. He said, he gave an example that in 1980 they changed from Ian Smith to Robert Mugabe, and that did not solve the problem. So if I quote him, we need to change the system first and foremost, more than we just need to change the person. And Dabengwa was very clear that we need to have a clear understanding of the idea of Zimbabwe. And his argument was that we must recognize that Zimbabwe is a multi-ethnic state. We are not just black and white, and I'm quoting him here. Shona and Ndebele, our society consists of many ethnic groups such as Karanga, Zezuru, Manika, Kalanga, Nambia, Soto, Venda, Shangani, Ndau, Xhosa, Korekore, and among many others. He emphasized that as a multinational formation, the task is not only to include these ethnic groups, but to accord them, and I quote, the same political, cultural, and ethnic and religious rights. And he thought the best way to do this was to then adopt genuinely and in a practical manner devolution of power from Harare to the regions. And he expressed that the idea of devolution is indeed a constituent part, a major constituent part of democracy. And let me end by saying, where do we begin to build the nation? Others seem not to worry about that, but I think it is important that we must know that we are highly divided. Ethnically, politically, we are polarized. In terms of generation, we are polarized. In terms of gender, we are polarized. And it is important that we have a starting point in which we rebuild. And I want to end by a reflection on that. And I want to reflect on the fact that what is the essential prerequisite for nation building today? And I want again to go back to say the open veins of Gukurahundi problem offers us a key rallying point to bring the nation building project back on the agenda as part of rebuilding a Zimbabwe that we all want. By making it a Machiavellian problem, we are again giving the perpetrators an escape route from accountability and minimizing its foundational negative consequences. We can't be spectators, if not complicit once more, on an issue which has now engulfed the whole nation. The first, I want to repeat what I said somewhere else, that the nation first died in Machiavelli and Miklands. And it is from there that we need to begin to build. And I'm saying this because, and I will try to prove why I'm saying that. In the first instance, the abuse of our military began during that time. Massive rape of women as a political tool and punishment started during Operation Gukurahundi. Denying people food because of political affiliation started during Operation Gukurahundi. Arrest and detention of political opponents in manufactured charges became rampant during Operation Gukurahundi. Deployment of army against citizens began during Operation Gukurahundi. Open writing of a section of the Zimbabwean population out of the nation and beyond the protection of the law began during Gukurahundi. The notion that patriotism can be forced through violence and prosecution began during Gukurahundi. Switching of media so as to commit atrocities began during Gukurahundi. Abduction and disappearance of the people happened during Gukurahundi. And if we accept this, then we've seen that it is this template which has then been nationalized. And everyone is now living in fear of these processes, which were tested, first of all, in Matabeleland and the Miklets. And if that is true, this is where we need to come together and try to say the state needs to be accountable for what it did. And we can't move forward unless this is resolved. And I think this will actually make the spirit of Comrade Dumiso Dabengwa rest in peace. Thank you so much. I'm not sure whether I was speaking alone.
No, you're audible, sir. You're clear.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Professor Sabelo, Gatsheni, Ndlovu, for delivering the Dabengwa Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much, sir.
Sure.
Right, you've been watching the Dumiso Dabengwa Memorial Lecture, which has been delivered by Professor Sabelo, Gatsheni, Ndlovu. Please do follow us on Twitter and do follow us on Facebook to follow more about the lecture. Thank you so much, sir, and have a pleasant day.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.